Just a minute. Please don't introduce yourself as my mother-in-law. My daughter-in-law said that to my wife right in the middle of her birthday party inside that brightly lit mansion in the Hamptons. I was standing behind them. I heard every word. My wife was holding a gift she had spent weeks making by hand. She froze, as if she no longer knew where to place her hands. My son was there. He said nothing. In that moment, I understood something very clearly. Some families don't fall apart because of poverty. They fall apart because of shame. Before the story goes any further, take a moment to subscribe to the channel and leave a comment telling me where you're listening to this story from. And now, let me continue. Because that moment at that party was not the end. It was only the beginning. I didn't say anything then. I just stood still, as if I were part of the white wall behind them. The music was loud enough to cover the real conversations. The clear glasses reflected the lights as if everything here had been designed so no one had to look at any one thing for too long. My daughter-in-law's birthday party unfolded exactly the way people describe the Hamptons. Spacious, clean, perfect, in a way that felt cold. The guests were well-dressed. They spoke in short sentences, full of implication. Everyone seemed busy, proving they belonged here. My wife and I were different. We arrived earlier than the invitation time because Laura has always believed that arriving early is a form of respect. We had driven nearly 5 hours from our home. Laura chose her favorite dress, light blue. Not new, but neatly pressed. I wore my old suit. It still fit, though the cuffs were slightly worn. On Laura's lap was a cloth bag she held carefully the entire drive. Inside was the birthday gift, a wool scarf she had knitted by hand, one stitch at a time, every evening after dinner. She told me Alexandra lived in large rooms, so maybe something warm and small would make them feel different. When we walked in, no one noticed. That didn't bother me. I was used to standing outside conversations not meant for me. Laura was different. She smiled at anyone who glanced her way, a habit from her years as an elementary school teacher, greeting the whole world without thinking. She spotted Alexandra in the distance, surrounded by friends, laughter rising and falling around her. Laura gently squeezed my hand. Her eyes lit up in that familiar way I had known for decades. Whenever she was about to do something for family, she walked toward them, holding the cloth bag close to her body. I followed a few steps behind, not out of hesitation, but because I wanted to let her move naturally. That was when she was stopped. No one around seemed to notice. Just a light touch on the arm, a smile that never changed, and a sentence lowered just enough for only 2 people to hear. I heard everything, more clearly than I wished I had. Laura said nothing. She stood still. The hand holding the gift trembled slightly, then went still. I saw her eyes. They weren't wet, but the light that had been there seconds ago was gone. She nodded very softly, as if she had just been reminded of a rule she never knew she had broken. Then she stepped back, standing beside me. The cloth bag now hung lower, near her knees. Jacob was not far away. He saw everything. I know because his eyes flicked toward us, then quickly turned away. He pretended to listen to someone else, nodded at the right moments, smiled at the right places. His silence wasn't loud, but it was clear enough for me to understand that in that moment he had chosen a side. We stayed a little longer. Laura no longer tried to start conversations. She sat on a chair near the window, looking out at the carefully trimmed garden. I poured her a glass of water and placed it in her hand, out of old habit. She took a small sip, set the glass down, and folded her hands together. I didn't ask anything. Some questions only make things heavier. Around us, the party went on. People laughed, raised their glasses, took photos. Alexandra stood at the center of every frame, bright, confident. No one knew, or no one wanted to know, that an older woman sat just a few steps away, trying to understand how she had just been quietly pushed out of her son's life. At that moment, I didn't feel angry. Not yet. What I felt was something very clear, very cold, slowly forming in my mind. I looked at this house, the white walls, the perfectly arranged objects, and I wondered how many of these things would truly stand if people stopped pretending. Laura turned to me and said softly that she was a little tired. I nodded. I took her hand. I felt the familiarity of that skin, and I realized something simple. Some introductions in life don't need words, and some silences, when they last long enough, become an answer. We left the party after the sky had darkened. There was no loud goodbye, no explanations. I simply draped a coat over Laura's shoulders and walked her to the car, the way I had done for many years. On the drive home, she stared out the window for a long time. I knew what she was thinking. I didn't ask. Some memories don't need an invitation. They find their own way back. As the wheels settled into a steady rhythm on the highway, I thought about a time when everything was simpler. When Jacob was little, he used to sit on my workbench, playing with leftover pieces of wood in the shop. I worked from early morning until late at night. 14 hours a day was not uncommon, not because I liked being away from home, but because I wanted to make sure my son would not have to start life with the same limits I had. Laura taught during the day. In the evenings, she tutored. Some nights, she fell asleep at the table, books still open. We never called it sacrifice. We called it what needed to be done. Jacob grew up in good schools. He learned how to speak with confidence, how to stand straight when entering a room, how to hide hesitation. I was proud of him. Laura was, too. Whenever he achieved something, she told the neighbors, old colleagues, as if his success were a reward for her quiet years. I never imagined that one day those very things would become what made him uncomfortable. After marrying Alexandra, Jacob began to change. Not all at once, more like a thin layer of dust settling over time. He started avoiding small family gatherings. Calls became less frequent. When we met, he often adjusted my shirt cuff, almost unconsciously. Laura noticed before I did. She began buying new clothes, even when she didn't need them. She asked me if her coat looked too old. I said no. She hung it back anyway. Alexandra entered Jacob's life like a door opening to another world. I don't deny that. She was used to parties, large houses, relationships built on business cards and knowing looks. I thought that if Jacob was happy, we could learn to step back. But stepping back does not mean being erased. At the time, I couldn't yet name that difference. Once at another party, I heard Alexandra talking to her friends. I wasn't standing too close, but close enough. She laughed and said her parents-in-law were people who used to work for others, now retired. She said it lightly, as if it were an unimportant detail in a story about houses, trips, and the life she was building. Jacob stood beside her. He didn't correct her. He nodded, out of habit. I didn't step forward. I didn't walk away either. I just stood there and remembered. That night, Laura asked if I had heard anything. I said yes. She was silent for a long time. Then she said that maybe we were no longer keeping up with our son's world. I didn't answer. I didn't think the problem was about keeping up. I thought the problem was, when did roots become something to hide? Those memories returned more clearly after the party in the Hamptons. I looked at Laura sitting beside me in the car. Her hands rested quietly on her lap. I remembered her standing in front of a classroom, voice warm, teaching children how to respect one another. I wondered if some of those lessons had never reached our son. When we got home, Laura placed the cloth bag on the table. The wool scarf was still inside, unopened. She touched it, then pulled her hand away. She said maybe the gift wasn't appropriate. I looked at the scarf. I thought about the evenings she spent knitting it, one steady stitch at a time, never rushing. I told her the problem wasn't the gift. That night I didn't go to sleep right away. I sat at the kitchen table, the same place where we once helped Jacob with homework, where we talked about his dreams. I thought about what had happened, not to decide who was right or wrong, but to understand. I realized that betrayal doesn't always come from big actions. Sometimes it's just a well-timed nod, a silence that lasts too long, and an introduction that quietly disappears. The next morning, Laura made coffee as usual. She asked if we should talk to Jacob. I said there would be a time, but not now. Some conversations need to be prepared with clarity, not emotion. I looked around our house, much smaller than the mansion in the Hamptons, but everything here had its place. I felt something slowly changing inside me, not loudly, not impulsively, just a decision taking shape. Gradually, the same way I have done everything my whole life. That decision didn't come from a moment of impulse. It came the way dry wood cracks after days in the sun, quietly, inevitably. I watched Laura as she set her coffee cup down, her hands calm as every other morning. She didn't ask anything more. She had known me long enough to recognize when my silence was just silence, and when it had begun to take the shape of something that needed to be done. That afternoon, Laura took the wool scarf out of the bag. She placed it on the table and smoothed out every fold. Maybe she said we should leave it there. Her voice was gentle. No blame. I nodded. I asked her to give me the envelope that went with it, the one I had prepared earlier. Not for the party, but for a day I knew would come. I didn't explain. She didn't ask. Evening came quickly. I called my lawyer when the kitchen had gone quiet. He answered after the second ring. A familiar voice. Calm. I spoke briefly. No stories. I asked him to prepare the files, to review old documents, agreements I had signed years ago, when Jacob was still in college, when my small investments had just begun to stand on their own. I didn't mention the party. I only said it's time to close a door. I remember those years clearly. Selling my first piece of land, signing my name with a trembling hand, not from fear, but from unfamiliarity with closed rooms and measured words. I had worked with wood my entire life. Wood does not lie. But I also understood that to protect a family sometimes you need papers more rigid than any plank. I held the title to the Hamptons property from the beginning. I set up a trust so Jacob would have a foundation. Not to show off, but so he would never have to bow his head to anyone. I never imagined that foundation would be turned into a step to walk away. That night, Laura went to bed early. I stayed up organizing things the way I always did. No long list, just a few tasks. In order, I placed the wool scarf into the envelope, along with a short note. Not a reproach, just a belated birthday wish. I wanted this gift to be the last one we gave, without explanation. The next morning I told Laura we were going back to the Hamptons. She looked at me, surprised, then nodded. On the drive, I went slower than the day before. Not out of hesitation, but because I wanted everything to move at the right pace. When we arrived, the party had long since ended. The house stood open, silent. I didn't go inside. I asked the security guard to deliver the envelope. I said we weren't available to meet. I left a message for Jacob. Tomorrow, you'll have the freedom you want. On the way home, Laura asked if we were going too far. I said no. Freedom isn't something others grant you. It's something that appears once the ties are faced honestly. She didn't say anything else. She leaned her head back and closed her eyes. I knew she was sad. I also knew she understood. That evening my phone vibrated. Jacob was calling. I didn't answer. I let it ring out, then turned the phone off. Not to avoid him, but to give future words a place to stand. I opened the files that had arrived by email, printed them, stacked them neatly. The numbers, the clauses, everything was clear. I read slowly, line by line, the way I read blueprints before cutting wood. The next morning, Laura made tea. I placed the folder into my bag, along with the wool scarf, still holding a small fold. I told her someone would be coming today. She asked if I needed her there. I said yes, not to speak, but to witness. She nodded. When the doorbell rang, I was already seated at the dining table. I didn't stand up right away. I wanted them to see preparation, not confrontation. I heard voices on the porch, hurried, uneasy. I took a breath, not deep, not long. I opened the door. I didn't feel satisfaction. I didn't feel relief. I felt a rare clarity, like fitting the final piece of wood into a frame. Everything suddenly standing straight. I invited them in, gestured to the chair across from me. I placed the folder on the table. I didn't push it forward. I didn't hide it. I said, we're going to talk, not about the party, but about what belongs to whom. Laura sat beside me, back straight, hands resting on her lap. The wool scarf stayed in the bag. I knew when the time came I would take it out, not as an apology, but as the final period, to a role we no longer needed to play. They sat down across from me. Jacob leaned forward. Alexandra kept her back straight, her eyes sweeping the room quickly, as if assessing a place that no longer belonged to her. I let them speak first. The complaints came out hurried, loosely arranged, about us leaving the party too early, about making someone uncomfortable, about interrupting their image. I heard enough to understand one thing. In their version of the story, our silence was the mistake. When they stopped, I opened the folder. Unhurried, I laid each page on the table neatly, letting everything appear in its proper order. I said we would not talk about feelings. I said today we were talking about ownership. The room went quiet. Alexandra tilted her head slightly, as if she wasn't used to a conversation turning in this direction. I started with simple facts. The Hamptons property. Whose name it was in. Since when? I pointed to the lines. The dates were clear. I spoke about the trust, its original purpose, its conditions, and what had been misunderstood over time. Jacob stared down at the table. I didn't look at him. I wanted the words to stand on their own, without needing my eyes. Alexandra let out a small laugh, disbelieving. She said those things were in the past, that their present life couldn't be pulled backward by old papers. I nodded. I said documents don't pull anything backward. They only remind. I said in this house everything has its place, including the truth. I continued, my voice unchanged, not louder, not softer. I said that starting today all financial support would end. The trust would be adjusted according to its terms. The Hamptons house would be reclaimed on the schedule already prepared. No surprises, only timelines. I placed the pen on the table beside my signature, a quiet signal that the explanation was complete. Jacob looked up. For the first time since he arrived, he said I was making things more complicated. I asked him calmly what had become complicated first. He didn't answer right away. Alexandra spoke instead. She said we were overreacting to a small misunderstanding at the party. I shook my head. I said, there was no misunderstanding here. There was a choice, and there was a long silence that had turned that choice into a habit. I opened my bag and took out the wool scarf. I placed it on the table between us. I said Laura had knitted it one stitch at a time, on ordinary evenings, with no spotlight. I said this gift didn't ask for an introduction. It only needed to be picked up with respect. Alexandra looked at the scarf, then at Laura. Her expression changed. Not quite regret, more like realizing something had just slipped out of her hands. Laura didn't speak. She sat upright, like someone who had spent a lifetime letting students understand the lesson for themselves. I said that if we had ever been called by another name in public, then today we were stepping out of that role. I said a builder has the right to leave a structure when it no longer needs honesty. Alexandra stood up. She spoke quickly. Too many words. Trying to keep her voice steady. She talked about reputation, connections, plans already arranged. I listened. Then I said those plans had been built on a false assumption. I said wealth is not something borrowed to hide origins. It is something you are responsible for. Jacob stood up after that. He looked at Laura, then at me. He said he never expected things to come to this. I said they had been coming here for a long time. We just hadn't looked away today. I said the freedom he wanted, the freedom of not introducing, was now in front of him. He could take everything that was his. What wasn't should be left behind. They left in silence. No door slammed, just footsteps moving faster, then disappearing. I sat back down. I didn't feel light. I didn't feel heavy. I felt right. Laura placed her hand on the table near the wool scarf. She let out a very quiet breath. I folded the scarf carefully and put it back into the bag. That afternoon I called my lawyer again to confirm the timeline. Everything moved as prepared. No rushing. No prolonged arguments. I looked out the window. Sunlight touched our small garden. I thought about the mansion in the Hamptons. Wide, bright, and empty in its own way. I felt no regret, only that everything had been returned to its proper name. That evening Laura asked if we had hurt anyone. I said the truth isn't meant to hurt. It's meant to stop. She nodded. We sat quietly, said nothing more. Some climaxes don't need applause. They end in a silence deep enough for everyone to hear themselves. The days that followed moved slowly to a very different rhythm. No more phones ringing nonstop. No more circular explanations. I woke up early, made coffee for Laura, opened the windows to let the sunlight in. The quiet wasn't emptiness. It felt like a room that had just been cleaned, where everything finally had its place. We followed the plan we had set. The Hamptons mansion was put on the market. I didn't go back there. I didn't need to see the white walls or wide windows again to know what I was leaving behind. I knew exactly what I was keeping. Laura was different. She spent time rereading her old notebooks. Names of students, short comments, written in blue ink. She said that if she could, she wanted to do something for children like those who once sat in her classroom. Children who tried hard but lacked opportunity. That's how the idea of a scholarship fund came to us. Quietly. No announcements. No ceremonies. I worked with a lawyer, setting simple, clear criteria. Laura wrote the introduction in her familiar teacher's voice. No big promises. just respect. And perseverance. When everything was ready, we signed our names side by side. I noticed Laura's hand was steadier than I expected. We sold the large house and moved into a small wooden home near a lake. No tall fences, just a narrow path leading to the water. In the mornings, I fixed the porch, replaced a few old boards. Laura planted more flowers. Neighbors stopped by to say hello. No one asked where we came from or where we used to live. They just asked if we needed an extra chair in the evening. I realized then, respect sometimes comes from very small things. Jacob called a few weeks later. His voice wasn't rushed anymore. He said things had changed faster than he expected. Relationships that once felt close had grown distant when the parties stopped. Alexandra hadn't stayed. I didn't ask more. I just listened. When he finished, I was quiet for a moment. Then I said I hoped he was safe. I didn't blame him. I didn't promise anything either. I told him that if one day he wanted to talk like an adult, without roles to play, our door was still open. The call ended cleanly, like a period placed where it belonged. Laura asked if I was sad. I thought for a moment and said, some sadness doesn't need to be fed. It comes to remind you to look back, then it leaves. She nodded. She understood that better than anyone. Autumn arrived. The lake lay still. I sat on the porch, sharpening a few old tools. Laura brought me a cup of tea. We sat side by side. No need to talk much. I thought about the wool scarf, now folded neatly in the closet. It was no longer a rejected gift. It had become a keepsake, a reminder that things made by hand and by time don't need to be displayed to have value. The scholarship fund began receiving its first applications. Laura read each letter slowly. Some words were clumsy, but sincere. She marked them carefully, writing notes in the margins. I looked at her and saw the woman who once stood in front of a classroom. I understood then. This was the legacy we wanted to leave behind. Not houses, not numbers, but a chain of opportunities, given the right way. One afternoon, as the sunlight slanted low, Laura said she felt lighter. I asked why. She said that finally she no longer had to worry about how she was introduced. I smiled. I said we don't need introductions anymore. We're living in the role that's truly ours. That night I wrote a few lines in an old notebook, not to claim credit, not to assign blame, just to remember. I wrote that some families stand because of money, and some stand because of self-respect. When forced to choose, I know which one I chose. If there is one thing I want to leave for Jacob, and for anyone else, it is this. Parents are the roots. Children are the leaves. Leaves may reach toward the sky to catch the sun, but roots must rest in the soil to nourish the whole tree. When roots are hidden out of shame, the tree may look beautiful for a while, but only when roots are respected does the tree truly live long. I closed the notebook. Laura turned off the light. Outside, the lake reflected a quiet sky. I didn't think about what was lost. I thought about what was kept and felt that it was enough. Thank you for listening to my story. If it touched you in any way, please tap, like to support it, subscribe so you don't miss the next story, and share it if you think someone else might need to hear this. Every like, every subscription gives us the strength to keep telling slow, honest, meaningful stories about family self-respect and choosing what is right. I'll see you in the next story.